This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Alan Guelzo, and he's a professor of the Civil War era and director of the Civil War era studies at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, a well-known town. He's the author of several books on Lincoln. I would say he is the leading scholar of Abraham Lincoln in America now. Abraham Lincoln Redeemer President, which won a prize, the Lincoln Prize in 2000. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the End of Slavery, which won another prize in 2005. And Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, which also won a prize in 2008. And recently he's written Abraham Lincoln as a Man of Ideas and Lincoln, A Very Short Introduction. And he's written a history of the Civil War, which I've just finished reading myself. I'm in the midst of his most recent book, I think it is, on Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. So this is a Lincoln scholar who's come to us today to speak on the Electoral College, certainly a timely topic. And he's found an interesting title for us, The Lovely, Fair, Judicious, and Democratic Meaning of the Electoral College. Let's check to see each one of those adjectives is justified. So, Alan Guelzo.
All right. Thank you, Harvey, very, very much indeed for the opportunity to participate in this program. And to all of you here, thank you for coming, and to all who have had a hand in making my brief visit here to Harvard a very pleasant experience. I do have some connections to Harvard going back a number of years when I was a fellow at the Warren Center in the mid-1990s. That was when it was still housed in Robinson Hall, and afforded the opportunity to interact with such luminaries as Bernard Bailyn and Donald Fleming, names well storied in Harvard yore. Well, let me talk about the Electoral College just for a little bit. We had gone back and forth on exactly the format to pursue with this, and what we settled on was that we would distribute in advance the text of this essay, and I would give a brief 15-minute run-through to warm things up, and then sit down and we can all go at it with knife and fork. But let me at least give you a brief encapsulation of what I mean by the lovely, fair, judicious, and democratic meaning of the Electoral College, a title which I have to confess quite shamelessly was meant to provoke people. After all, if you simply offer a lecture on why I like the Electoral College, nobody is really going to come to it because it's really not a subject that people waste a great deal of time upon, at least not for usually 3 years and 11 months of any given presidential term. All of a sudden, it will erupt every 4 years, something like Old Faithful. So you can expect this big spout of energy on the subject of the Electoral College. But I felt the subject really did need a little bit of help to make it sound compelling. So I did, in a rather free and perhaps libertine fashion, suggest all these other meanings as well. We'll see if they live up to it. The Electoral College, as you have no doubt noticed, has come in for more than a little criticism in the last several months. The results of the 2016 election were not only surprising, but for many people dismaying because of the nature of the way the election results resulted. A victory in the Electoral College, but not in the popular vote. And that led many commentators to really push the op-ed panic buttons on the subject of the Electoral College. You saw this from E.J. Dione in the Washington Post. You saw it from the New York Times editorial board, the New York Review of Books, and you saw it from Yale's Akil Reed Amar, not only objecting to what they believed was the undemocratic nature of the Electoral College, but even indicting it for a few other crimes as well. Amar, in particular, has held the Electoral College up on the toasting fork for being an adjunct of slavery. And as Amar says, in a direct election system, the North would outnumber the South, whose many slaves, more than 500,000 in all, of course, could not vote. But the Electoral College instead let each Southern state count its slaves, albeit with a 2/5 discount, in computing its share of the overall count. So not only has the Electoral College frequently selected the wrong people, in someone's estimate, but it is also complicit with slavery. How often has the Electoral College posed a problem? Well, curiously enough, really only on 5 occasions in American political history. In 1824, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay were all major nominees. So you did have a big split in the popular vote, and you also had a split in the Electoral College vote. Enough of a split that the election ended up being thrown into the House of Representatives, where John Quincy Adams ultimately was selected as president in connection with what was widely described as the corrupt bargain between Clay and Quincy Adams. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is the first president to be elected without any kind of popular majority, but with a whopping total in the Electoral College. So you have to move from 1824 to 1860 really to get a clear-cut example of someone who would not have won a popular majority, but nevertheless wins the presidency because of the Electoral College. Then in 1876, it happens again. This time, Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes. Samuel Tilden really wins the popular vote, but by a lot of internal political machinations, the Electoral College majority is awarded to Rutherford B. Hayes. The Electoral College majority in this case is a grand sum total of 1 vote, 185 to 184, but it is sufficient to elect Hayes as president. As with the Jackson, Adams, and Clay election in 1824, there's a good deal of behind the scenes and not always free from corrupt accusations going on behind the curtain. And then we have a long period in which the Electoral College really is not much of a serious issue, until 2000, when you have Bush versus Gore, and the hanging chads proceed to dance across the national television screens. And then, of course, most recently, Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton, where Mrs. Clinton wins 3 million more popular votes, but Mr. Trump wins a decisive majority in the Electoral College. Well, these have been the occasions, and when you take it in the long run of American electoral history, it's rather surprising that there have been this few elections that really have made question marks for the Electoral College. What the Electoral College does is it reminds us that, first of all, we are a constitutional republic. And we are governed by a constitution. And in that constitution, we have a mechanism identified for electing presidents. And this is it. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. That's it. It surprises people over and over again when I point out to them that when the Constitution describes the process of electing a president, this is it. There is no provision in the Constitution for a popular vote, a popular election, a popular majority, nothing of the sort. The only mechanism described in the Constitution for electing a president is the Electoral College. By the way, the term Electoral College is not in the Constitution either. At least the term college is not. That was, in fact, first used by James Madison and has become a standard reference. But even the term college is not actually in the Constitution. It's made for some unusual observations. I mean, the Electoral College would be the only college in the country without a football team. What's more, its alumni association, at least half of them would be losers. So there could be some real problems in trying to think of this as a college. We're not only a constitutional republic, what the Electoral College also tells us is that we are a federal republic. That fundamentally the nature of the American political regime is that of a federal union. And the Electoral College is, in that respect, a very clear mirror image of what it means to be a federal republic. It is not a case where the Constitution ever had in view the idea of a mass, general, direct popular election. And that is in large measure because we are not a large, general, mass, popular government. We are a federal republic. The Electoral College captures that. Why the Electoral College? Well, because the members of the Constitutional Convention were themselves very concerned about what the office of the president was going to be like. The fundamental question in the Constitutional Convention was whether the president should be elected at large by the people. I mean, they did debate that there. It wasn't simply that the Constitutional Convention were a bunch of pale-faced elites who never once had a democratic thought in their lives. There was serious debate about how the president should be elected and whether it should be a national direct election. But the real question came down to, if you have a national direct election, is that going to take us in the wrong directions politically? The alternative was to elect the president by the national legislature, by the Congress. But that too had its problems, and those problems get explained this way. This is Gouverneur Morris in the image. And it's Gouverneur Morris who argues, along with James Wilson, vigorously in favor of a direct popular election, rather than electing the president by the legislature. The legislature, Congress, says Morris, will continually seek to aggrandize and perpetuate themselves, and will seize those critical moments produced by war, invasion, or convulsion for that purpose. It is necessary then that the executive magistrate should be the guardian of the people, even of the lower classes, against legislative tyranny, against the great and the wealthy, who in the course of things will necessarily compose the legislative body. So you have a direct election of the president, argued Morris, basically to keep Congress at bay. Because Congress is going to be where the power is, and what you want to do is to have a president who is elected directly by the people and can speak for the people against the interests of Congress. On the other hand, the argument went, if the legislature elect the president, it will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. It will be like the election of a pope by a conclave of cardinals. The executive, therefore, ought to be so constituted as to be the great protector of the mass of the people, almost as though you were electing tribunes. But that, of course, is not what they eventually came up with as a mechanism. The mechanism that the Constitutional Convention does settle upon is neither direct election by the people as a whole or by the legislature, but by the states. Again, harking back and underscoring the federal nature of the system. This still hasn't put the quietus, though, to many objections to the Electoral College, and just a few of them that no doubt you have heard. The Electoral College, it is said, violates the principle of one man, one vote. And you can do the math on this pretty easily. This is one thing I tried to lay out as clearly as I could in the essay, and that is when you have an electoral college vote for a state determined on the basis of its representatives plus its 2 senators, you get a situation where in Wyoming, for instance, it takes approximately 1/6 the number of people to cast indirectly an electoral vote as it does in California. So if you're a Californian, you only count 1/6 of a voter as compared to a voter in Wyoming because of the Electoral College. So it is objected that violates the principle of one man, one vote. Then we come back to the argument that, well, the Electoral College was designed to protect slavery. Because since the southern states, the slave states, benefited from the 3/5 clause, they had an abnormally swollen number of representatives that gave them extra leverage in selecting a president, and so the selection of presidents is deeply influenced by slavery. To come back to Professor Amar's argument, Southerner Thomas Jefferson, for example, won the election of 1800-01 against Northerner John Adams in a race where the slavery skew of the Electoral College was the decisive margin of victory. Without the extra Electoral College votes generated by slavery, the mostly Southern states that supported Jefferson would not have sufficed to give him a majority. As pointed observers remarked at that time, Thomas Jefferson metaphorically rode into the executive mansion on the backs of slaves. So that's a serious indictment. And then you have the addendum to that indictment coming from the words of James Madison himself. I mean, not only Jefferson. On July 19th, 1787, in the midst of debate in the convention about the Electoral College, James Madison offers this comment. If it be a fundamental principle of free government that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers should be separately exercised, it is equally so that they be independently exercised. There is the same and perhaps greater reason why the executive should be independent of the legislature than why the judiciary should. A coalition of the two former powers would be immediately and certainly dangerous to public liberty. There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffuse in the northern and the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed to be, on the whole, liable to fewest objections. So what you get when you read this comment in Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention is this great aha. See, Madison is promoting the Electoral College because it will somehow act in the interests of slavery. A third objection is the Electoral College is so cumbersome. Why can't we just have an election on election day and be done with it? And again, the question is cumbersome. All right, what do we mean by cumbersome? So these are the kinds of objections that have been laid out as objections to the Electoral College itself, frequently as arguments why it should be gotten rid of. But I am not quite so enthused about those arguments as you have been able to read. So I think at this point the best thing for us to do is, having laid all the problems out, to see what it is we want to have to say about them. So I believe, Harvey, you are the moderator, and you may now take charge of everyone.
Yes, okay, Reggie, why don't you start?
Your essay makes a lot of good points, but it doesn't address the fact, I think, that in the lifetime of everyone in this room, the two worst presidents have been produced by the Electoral College. I hope so. The debate, I think we ought to realize the debate is larger than either keeping the status quo the way it is or doing nothing. I wonder if there are any adjustments that you would accept. Of course, one way of doing away with the Electoral College that your opinions would be appreciated on is the National Popular Vote Initiative, which I think, well, of course, there are other things that might be done to change the situation. I wonder if you see any need at all to change the situation, and if so, what methods you might endorse.
Well, it seems to me that you're really asking three questions here. One is the Electoral College a botch because it gives us the wrong people? Or is the Electoral College alternately something that should be amended, or alternately is something like the National Popular Vote Initiative a means for doing that? Well, it's difficult to respond to the third one because, of course, opinions are going to vary on whether one happens to think a president is worst, best, mediocre, intermediate, that way. It may be that the presidents who've been given to us by the Electoral College have sometimes been less than ideal. Rutherford B. Hayes usually does not stand out very prominently as an example of a great president. On the other hand, it did give us Abraham Lincoln. So if you have to judge purely by results, if to sacrifice Rutherford Hayes or George W. Bush or Mr. Trump, if in sacrificing them you must also erase Abraham Lincoln, I think I'll stick with Abraham Lincoln and take my chances.
You don't think Lincoln could have won a popular election with the plurality he got?
No. He only got 39% of the popular vote.
That was the plurality. Nobody got more. If nobody wins the majority, you have to have a plurality.
If the Democratic Party had united on one candidate instead of splitting between Breckinridge and Douglas, they would have had a larger popular vote easily than Lincoln, but they would still have fallen far short in the Electoral College. So even if you had, you actually would have had a situation even worse in 1860, because you would have had a losing Democratic candidate with a clear-cut popular majority, but you still would not have had that candidate elected because Lincoln would have won the Electoral College notwithstanding. His Electoral College margin was so great. So the objection would actually become even more pointed at that point, and you'd really have a case in 1860 that would compare almost directly to 2016. So again, I come back to the question, well, yes, it might be all well and good to say, well, we don't like that particular candidate, but if we're going to get rid of that, well, we also have to face the conclusion that perhaps we should have gotten rid of Abraham Lincoln, which is not a conclusion I'm eager to draw. Now, the second question that you're asking is, should the Electoral College, is there a mechanism for eliminating the Electoral College? Well, of course there is. You can amend the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College entirely. All right, suppose we take the Electoral College off the map. What do we get as the results? Well, you get a national popular election. But be careful what you wish for. Because in the case of a general national popular election, a direct election of a president, then the rules of campaigning are going to change in some very dramatic ways. And you may not like that result either. In large measure, Mrs. Clinton's majority was drawn almost entirely from two metropolitan areas, the Chicago area and the Los Angeles area. And it could just as easily be said, well, I don't like presidents chosen by the Electoral College. Well, you could counter that by saying, well, I don't particularly care for presidents elected by Chicago and Los Angeles. You will have problems and unintended consequences no matter what direction you move in. I think it's also significant this way that a direct popular election by no means guarantees the quote, the will of the people. If you look at those nations which employ a direct popular election, they include some real staggering losers, politically speaking. Afghanistan, Mexico, Iran. These are not exactly regimes notable for automatic guaranteed democratic results. So getting rid of the Electoral College might seem like, let's get rid of that particular problem, without realizing that you could invite a host of other problems that would make you, after a short while, bang your forehead with the palm of your hand and say, what were we thinking? Then the third thing you'd ask about was the National Popular Vote Initiative. The National Popular Vote Initiative is an interesting mechanism because it preserves the Electoral College. It doesn't try to eliminate the Electoral College at all. But what it does is get the states to agree that their votes, their electoral votes, will be cast in such a way as to reflect the popular vote, so that there's harmony between the two. The principal difficulty with that is that it would not be constitutional, because the Constitution itself forbids collusion, so to speak, between states in making decisions of that sort. So the National Popular Vote Initiative, which has been signed on to by a number of states, significantly all of them Democratic, but the National Popular Vote Initiative, which has been signed on to by some states, certainly has not been signed on to by all states, and secondly, is probably not going to pass muster in the courts, because the first time it would be put into application, it would probably be challenged, go up to the Supreme Court, and I suspect be struck down. Now, and if you want to look at the constitutional crisis that would ensue after that, because then you would have had a president chosen on that basis only to have the mechanism itself struck down. Then you'd have a constitutional crisis of really serious proportions, because who would then be the president? So there are interesting aspects of each part of what you've said, but there are also some significant problems that might make us hesitate before we reach too quickly for them as solutions.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I would add to the list of the objections a fourth one, in that the Electoral College doesn't serve any meaningful purpose. And I'm thinking about the history of it, and there was the North and the South, the federalism which you talk about, the big states versus the small states, and it seems to me all of those rationale have disappeared, and what we end up with is kind of this situation for each election where all the attention is on anywhere from 6 to a dozen states, depending upon who's quote in play, and the rest of the populace, large states, small states. I come from the state of Montana, which is reliably a red state, and I don't think ever sees a presidential candidate in there. And Texas is a huge state, and
Well, if they look up, they can see them fly over.
they can see them fly over, right? But so you have small states and big states that are ignored in this process, and I fail to see really what's the rationale of continuing the and these small states and big states. They don't necessarily have. Unlike when you go back to 1789, you had economies which were fairly similar in the South and the North, but you have states that can be North Dakota and South Dakota, totally different economies, but they're next to each other. So, what's really is a purpose is being fulfilled by this electoral college?
Well, there are two ways to respond to that. One theoretical, the other practical. The theoretical response comes back to the nature of the American system being a federal system. Now, some people have wondered if today federalism really has any kind of meaning similar to that enjoyed in 1787. In other words, have we outgrown federalism? Are we not, in fact, a very different kind of political nation than we were in 1787? And there's some ways in which that is very obviously true. However, the 2 points that I come back to as matters of objection that way are A, well, that may be in some respects true, but the Constitution. The Constitution is still the document that governs us, and if we want to eliminate the Electoral College, then what we're really doing is eliminating one of the major symbols of federalism within the Constitution. The Constitution is a federal constitution. So if we want to alter the Electoral College, and by the way, the description of the mechanism of the Electoral College is actually the single largest issue in the entire Constitution. Larger than interstate comity, larger than commerce. The Constitutional Convention put a lot of care into the construction of that, so that the description of the Electoral College really amounts to almost 10% of the entire word length of the Constitution. It's a big part of it. So my feeling is, well, if we want to, on the basis of saying that federalism is really only a shadow of what it once was, if on that basis we want to take away the Electoral College, then I think what we've really got to do is go the distance. Because then you got the whole rest of the document, which is about federalism. I think you're going to have a convention of the states and write an entirely new instrument of government. And some people would be very happy with that. I don't think that the possibilities of that are very likely. And I think that it probably would jeopardize the notion of federalism, which brings me to my second point, and that is federalism is about the dissipation of political power. It is first of all, on the part of the Constitutional Convention, a simple recognition that they were never going to get these states to act together unless they did it as a federation. But it's also a recognition of Madison's guiding principle in the Federalist, that the threat of power, of political power, is so great that what you want to do is try to distribute it in as many bits as you possibly can. The distribution of power is really what federalism is all about, and the Electoral College represents that. So simply for the practical sense of the diffusion of power, I think that the Electoral College, as part of the overall federal system, is something that we might end up liking a whole lot more if we thought about it in that context. I want to add one other thing, too, of a practical nature. It is true that most states don't really play a part. I've heard people argue on behalf of the Electoral College, and I think wrongly, that the Electoral College forces candidates to visit places they would not otherwise visit. That's only partly true. Candidates will visit 10 to 12 states on a regular basis during a campaign. And they'll do that because of the Electoral College. That certainly is far from visiting all 50. I can't remember when Alaska and Hawaii have ever been visited on a presidential campaign, much less Montana. On the other hand, if you go to a direct popular election, then the number of places visited by presidential candidates will probably shrink to about 2 or 3. And although 10 and 12 is not ideal, it sure beats 2 and 3. So in a world of compensations, maybe that is the best we can expect, and maybe we shouldn't jettison it with too much eagerness.
Russ.
I wonder if you could respond to Professor Amar.
I've tried.
And his charge.
He's twice backed out on me.
Oh, I don't mean literally, but is he correct that Jefferson metaphorically rode to the White House on the backs of slaves?
Only if you play it very, very, very metaphorically. The big objection I have raised, and I've never heard Amar respond to this, I keep trying to pin this down, is that the Constitutional Convention, when it comes together, is composed of delegates from all of the states except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island won't participate. So you have 12 states represented in the Constitutional Convention. In those 12 states, all but one had legalized slavery in 1787. Most of the people who make, and I suspect Amar himself, make this argument because they're thinking of the 1860s. They're thinking of the Civil War. They're thinking of what happened after the Constitutional Convention, when, as you move into the 19th century, yes, the 3/5 clause does give some unfair advantage. But that is an unanticipated consequence of what happens in Philadelphia in 1787. In 1787, all the states except Massachusetts were slave-owning states. So if you suggest that the Electoral College is doing something unfair because it's designed to give the slave states a thumb on the balance, that doesn't end up meaning a whole lot when it turns out that everybody's thumb then is on the balance. Because they're all slave states. There is no advantage to slave versus free states. Now that will become that later on. But the members of the Constitutional Convention were not prophets. They didn't have screens in which they could see the future. So when they are designing the Electoral College, and even when they're designing it, well, actually they're taking over from the Articles of Confederation, the 3/5 clause, they're not doing it because these selfish southern slave-owning states are looking for an advantage over northern free states. There isn't any advantage, because they're all, except for Massachusetts, slave states.
Well, if we reran the apportionment of electors in the election of 1800, such that slaves were not counted in the apportionment of electors at all, instead of 3/5 that were 0, and you could say unless they were enfranchised and could vote, which they couldn't, so a non-voting slave, disenfranchised slave would get 0 in the apportionment of electors. Would Jefferson have still won?
Possibly, but you've got to go back and calculate the 3/5 that's represented by those states which in 1800 in the North still had legalized slavery, which included Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania in 1780 takes the first step toward emancipation of slaves, but it's a gradual emancipation program. Now, there are still legal slaves in Pennsylvania as late as 1840. New York still has legalized slavery. New Jersey still has legalized slavery. Even in the election of 1800, to suggest that somehow slavery in the southern states gets this added advantage because of the Electoral College, because of the 3/5 clause, is deliberately ignoring that there was a 3/5 clause that operated for most of the northern states as well. The other objection I have to that is that, yes, but that's 1800. The Constitutional Convention is meeting in 1787. They can't think 13 years into the future and see, yes, 13 years from now, in a great conspiratorial moment, we will have an advantage. They're not prophets. They're politicians. They're lawyers. And for that reason, to assume that because you get certain results in the elections in 1800 or 1804 or 1808 and so on and so forth, that is something that was designed by the Constitutional Convention of 1787, to me is an egregious historical gap in one's thinking. But I see it made over and over again.
Harvey Nelson.
There's another thing that might be stand to the advantage of the Electoral College. I remember reading years ago an article written by two professors. One was named Weaver from Harvard. I don't remember the other one. They focused on the election of 1960, which was probably the closest in American history. Made the case that it's possible that Richard Nixon actually won that election. But in any case, had there been a back and forth over a popular vote as to who won, the election would have dragged on for months. Irregularities in Cook County in Illinois, Mayor Daley's machine.
Oh, really?
In Texas, with Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president, would have dragged the thing out, allegations of corruption, etc. At the height of the Cold War, this would have been intolerable, even dangerous. The Electoral College was clear-cut and gave Kennedy the imprimatur to govern and be the leader of the free world. And that was a very important statement that needed to be transmitted to the Soviet Union at the time when there was confrontation. As it was, we were then followed by the Bay of Pigs and the confrontation with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of '62. But this was an advantage unforeseen that the Electoral College endowed on the country by conferring the authority of leadership to a president who had won, at best, a very narrow victory.
Well, I think this raises two interesting issues. One is, in a democracy, the most critical aspect of an election is legitimacy, and the one most easily contested. And if the Electoral College does nothing, it does confer legitimacy. The second thing about the electoral, about the 1860 election in particular, when you look at a mass direct popular election, what are the opportunities for irregularities? In a mass national popular election, you have an open invitation for electoral fraud that is going to be next to impossible to regulate. Under the Electoral College, there is no point to conducting a fraudulent vote operation in Montana, all right? Because the number of electoral votes at stake just doesn't make it worth it, right? So you've got 3 electoral votes coming from Montana. Oh yeah, that's really going to be worth running the risk of voter fraud. On the other hand, if you have a direct national public election, Montana becomes the ideal place to suddenly have the resurrection of the dead take place, as it does every 4 years in Chicago, and have voting irregularities of various sorts. And then it becomes harder to track down because you will have it not only in Montana, but you'll have it in North and South Dakota. You'll have it in places very hard. You will have to create an electoral mechanism, an electoral process so complicated and so cumbersome that you may well wind up yearning for the good old days of the Electoral College, because voter fraud will then become a much more viable answer to getting a candidate elected. When you can hide it in all these other different corners of the country, that under the present system, you really don't have much of an incentive to do.
Matthias.
Thank you. I'd like you to, by the way, let me just give you a disclaimer. I have not read the essay, so this may be addressed in the essay, but I'm not sure. If it does, I apologize. The question has to do with the other aspects of the way electors cast their votes, specifically with the one where they have to cast 2 votes. One for a candidate outside their state and one for a candidate which they can choose.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite getting the drift of your question.
Well, the question is, so I just wanted to tell you that's what the question is about.
You mean the
question-
electors themselves in the
The
states?
electors have to cast 2 votes, not 1, right? When the Electoral College electors have to cast 2 votes in the original formulation, correct?
Oh, the original, yes, the 1787 formulation, which was then amended in 1804.
Yes. So in the original formulation, do you think that there was some intent to be read into that, which we are today, because of the for later amendment, forgetting, and/or would that color the actual purpose of the Electoral College in a way which we today may not be particularly sensitized to because that was amended?
Well, the election of 1800 really did expose a problem with the Electoral College system on the basis of that 2-vote casting that was done. Because under the original system, the electors would cast votes for a president and a vice president. Well, that flew in the face of what became a practical reality, and that is political parties. That candidates for the offices were not really running for those offices, they were running as pairs. And in 1800, what you get is a moment when Thomas Jefferson, running for president, and Aaron Burr as his putative vice president, both get 74 electoral votes. And you have this very embarrassing situation in which Jefferson writes to Burr. You can almost hear him clearing his throat in a very stentorian fashion, like, we did have an agreement about me being president. And at that point, Burr's response is more or less along the lines of, Agreement? We don't need no stinking agreement. And Burr goes into full gear trying to usurp Jefferson. Well, the whole thing gets thrown into the House of Representatives. They go through 36 ballots before finally James Bayard of Delaware decides that he's going to not to vote, and that gives the edge to Jefferson. And so Jefferson does, in fact, become president and Burr vice president. But it's a very embarrassing moment, and they had not anticipated this because in 1787 they had not anticipated the emergence of political parties. They move at once to correct that significantly. They do not move to correct it by getting rid of the Electoral College. What they do is to amend the Constitution in the 12th Amendment, and they close that loophole. But after having done that in 1804, that's the way the Electoral College has worked ever since.
But to your point, about the fact that it kind of spreads the geographical importance of each elector, in that original formulation, the electors could only vote for one. They could only cast one of those votes for in-state, for somebody from their own state. And the second vote had to be for somebody from outside their state.
Well, there is a requirement to this day in the Constitution that president and vice president be from a different state.
Right.
This is why Dick Cheney hurriedly signed himself up to be from Wyoming instead of from Texas. But I don't see in the 1787 convention any movement or any deliberation that found that to be a problem. They were simply distributing power among the states. That was itself a federalist gesture. What becomes problematic about it is when you have the development of candidates who are really representing political parties rather than simply running as individuals.
The disadvantage of the revised system that maybe you were referring to is that originally, I think the vice president was meant to be a kind of booby prize for somebody who came in second, who was running for president. So you would have a higher quality, presumed quality in the vice presidency. You would have in the vice presidency a person who some people or many people thought deserved to be president. Whereas under the new system where you vote for, and therefore the vice presidency was a kind of, which Nance Garner said was like as valuable as a bucket of warm spit. The vice president was a kind of booby prize for the person who came in second, and it assured that that person would have presidential capacity or aptitude, at least in people's opinion. Whereas now the vice presidency is a lower rank of persons. It's somebody who you think might be a decent president in an emergency, but not somebody who's running in the front rank.
Well, it's hard to know because there's no explication of this in the debates reported out of the convention. The term booby prize does not occur in the Constitution. Would have made things a lot more lively if it had. Hannibal Hamlin, who was Lincoln's first vice president, once described being vice president as being a contingent somebody. And he didn't mean that in a complimentary fashion. But at least in the general creation of it, what it does appear is that the vice president was looked upon as being someone who could possibly be a president in waiting, that there was a succession, so to speak. And sure enough, John Adams will succeed George Washington. Thomas Jefferson ends up being vice president quite unwillingly to John Adams. Well, he winds up as a successor. But that very quickly shows itself not to be an automatic proposition, especially once presidential candidates become the figureheads for political parties.
Sorry, if I may just color this finally. The question that I made was actually, the source was a lecture that I attended by Professor Ralph Lerner from the University of Chicago. And I remember distinctly, and it was many years ago, but about 29 years ago. But what he said was his interpretation of the Constitution was that the reason why electors had to cast one vote in state and one out of state was that, for one, the idea was that there would be, of course, we're talking about an earlier time of communication, there would be somebody whose reputation would transcend enough that people from many states would be able to agree on. Mm-hmm. But naturally, people would only know those people from their own state. So they were, in a way, being forced to come out of their state to this federal arrangement. And that was a compulsory, interestingly, it was a compulsion. It wasn't a kind of a voluntary thing. And I think that was really the purpose. That wasn't there really this kind of like, let's get everybody out there into this federal thinking from the very beginning?
Well, far be it from me to second guess Ralph Lerner. I think, though, what we're trying to do is to thrash about in a vacuum, because the notes on the Constitutional Convention simply don't tell us. I mean, there are records of what went on in the Constitutional Convention, the most famous of which are Madison's notes. Of course, Madison's notes themselves are not beyond question. Madison had tinkered with them for decades. He wouldn't publish them while he was alive. He'd only let them be published after he was gone. And it's a very strong possibility that he wrote stuff in that had not actually been said. In fact, this one speech that I have up on the screen, which seems to me to be such an odd moment in that debate on July 19th, my own suspicion is that Madison interpolated that later. I mean, he said something, whether that is what he said at the time is another question. But it has the thumbprint, at least in my reading, of being something that Madison then later filled in as his explanation of the point he was trying to make. What point he actually did make on July 19th is probably forever lost, and largely because the vow of secrecy, which the convention imposed on its members, was kept quite religiously. Washington enforced it very strenuously. On one occasion, when Washington felt that someone had been talking a bit out of turn, Washington made one of the few utterances he made on the floor of the convention about not talking about the convention's business outside the walls of the assembly room in Independence Hall. So when you look at it that way, one of the problems we deal with is we're frequently second-guessing the convention. We're doing it in a vacuum, and we even have to be a little cautious about Madison's notes of the convention simply because he tinkered with them. He also had a rival, by the way, in the form of Charles Pinckney, and some of Pinckney's notes on the convention that Madison was very eager to discredit Pinckney, and that enters into it as well. So,
Wasn't there a phrase, continental characters? That is, those who transcended, whose reputation and fame
yes,
transcended these were not native sons, but they would be somebody that would appeal to all parts of the republic.
right.
It's suggesting that a federal republic is not only one that disperses power to the states, but one also that concentrates power from the states in a particular figure.
And of course,
And the need for that was very well shown in a certain crisis that occurred later on in 1860.
yes. Well, everyone, almost in an unspoken way, understood that the ultimate continental character in the Constitutional Convention was Washington. And one thing which makes the debates about the structuring of the executive move along as it did was the assumption that people had that Washington would unquestionably be the first national executive.
Yes, Alex. Get the next.
Two questions, somewhat related. So firstly, you made a remark which I didn't understand, namely that if the Electoral College were abolished and there was a direct popular election, candidates would only visit 2 or 3 places in the country.
Yeah.
Whereas I would have thought that, for example, if getting 40% rather than 30% of the vote in California mattered, Republicans would probably visit California. Secondly, there's this quirk in the system that occurs in Maine and possibly another state where they allocate by
Nebraska.
convention. Nebraska. So could you briefly explain the history of that? Also, would that be a preferable option in some cases, because that would encourage candidates to visit more places if you allocate it in some cases by district?
Well, right now, the Electoral College system is a winner-take-all in 48 of the 50 states. Whoever wins a majority of a popular vote within a state, that particular candidate gets all of the state's votes. So that's not a constitutional requirement. That's a state requirement. Because under the terms in which the Constitution describes the Electoral College, it's up to each state to decide how it wants its electors to vote. And as late as 1860, South Carolina selected its electors from the state legislature. There was no popular vote. It was the state legislature who designated the state electors. So the idea has always been that even if you have a candidate who wins in a particular state by 1 vote, they still clean up all the electoral votes of that state. Now, what Nebraska and Maine have done has been, in their individual capacities, to do what the National Popular Vote Initiative has asked to be done. And that is to divide votes according to who wins a popular majority and who does not. And in this case, Maine and Nebraska do it as a proportion. If a particular candidate wins, let's say 55% of the popular vote in Nebraska, then that's reflected in the number of Nebraska's electoral votes that go to them as opposed to the other character. Now, that, again, has a nice ring in theory. But it becomes more problematic when you start having to work things out to decimal points. I mean, suppose you have a race in which there are 3 presidential candidates, 4 presidential candidates. I mean, this last election we had not only Republican, Democrat, we also had Libertarian and Green, both of which made very strong showings, better showings than they'd ever made in previous elections.
Wasn't it the case that Hillary Clinton did not get a majority of the popular vote?
She did not get a majority. She got a plurality, but not a majority. In such a case, you can find yourself trying to divide votes in a very mathematical fashion. So is someone, let's say if a state is awarding 5 electoral votes, well, is it going to go 2 to 3, or is it go 2.5, 2.5, 2.25, 2.75? How is it going to be structured? Now, in a sense, the states have the right to make that determination. But it doesn't take away the questions. All it does is bring in a new set of questions and objections.
In Maine, there's a certain district, right, where a candidate can take 1 or 2 elections.
Yes, and I think it's easier in Maine because Maine has, if I'm remembering this correctly, 3 congressional districts. That does kind of 2.
Isn't it 2?
I thought it was 3, but
I don't know.
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't come from Maine. But as soon as you begin moving into states like Pennsylvania, Texas, California, Ohio, then you start dealing with percentages. And then it gets very dicey.
Yes.
I have a question about the history of how the electors themselves have conceived of the purpose of the Electoral College. So I have kind of 2 oversimplified ends of the spectrum in mind. One end being, our job is just to sort of, we're a formal mechanism. Whoever our constituents wanted to be elected, we vote for that person. The other end of the spectrum being something like I think it's Federalist 68, about sort of a check on the people and what the people might want may not be the best for the country, and so we're supposed to deliberate about this. And so is there a literature on the history of electors and how they've conceived of their purpose in terms of these 2 poles? For example, I've just anecdotally...
No, you're going to have to do it.
Just anecdotally, I've heard of, in this last election, electors saying, well, you know what, this is what my constituents want, I have to vote for this person. So I was curious if in the 18th or 19th century it was different.
Well, in the 19th century, you have these 3 contested elections. But I've never seen a situation in those elections where the electors themselves raised a question about, well, who exactly should we be voting for? Bear in mind that in the earliest presidential elections, for Washington, for Adams, nobody bothered to take or record a national popular vote because it was so clearly a matter of the state electors doing it. The only question was, how many electoral votes do Washington and Adams get? It was up to each state to determine how they were going to handle popular voting, if they were going to handle it at all.
No historian ever added up votes in the states in those elections?
In many cases, there's no record of it.
No record, okay.
In many cases, because it was not important to keep. And therefore, in South Carolina, of course, they didn't have it at all. And it was the state legislature made the designation. So it's impossible to say what a popular vote was for Washington or for anyone else that way. So in the places where there was a popular election for a president, what really counted was what was happening within that state. Where there's a popular vote, it's a popular vote within that state for a president. And then whoever wins in that state, that's the electoral vote that gets cast for a president. Early on, the electoral vote itself so greatly overshadows the idea of popular voting that we really don't have an accurate determination of what popular vote might have been cast on behalf of George Washington or John Adams. You can't keep a record of it. It's too spotty.
It could be said right now that you do have a popular vote. We do decide the presidency by a popular vote, but in 50 different districts.
As it were, yes. that is another way of doing it. And it's the districts casting votes which make the final determination for president.
Yes.
The thing that's fascinating to me and surprises some people is that there's no federal elections. All the elections are run by individual states. They create the rules, they create the ballots, they create how they're counted.
And the machines that are used.
And the machines that are used.
And the schedule.
That's right. And so that basically the power of the government is resting partly on the states. And what I find when I get into this discussion is that people generally see the states as a constituency in the process, as if it were like the European Union, with each country having its unique culture, its laws. I mean, we have states that have legalized marijuana, have states with their own internal regulations of how roads are done, people can turn right. I mean, it's all run by the states. And if you see the state as a part of the constituency, there's the general election of what each person votes, and the will of the whole group as a state. It's like the Senate. There are 2 people from each state. All the states are equal, and they can have some say in how the country is run. And I think to look at an election as a hybrid of 2 constituencies, one of the state and one of the popular vote in the state.
Well, you raised 2 interesting points, and the first of them goes back to the gentleman from Montana, speaking about how Montana gets to cast 3 electoral votes. But each one of those votes, given the population of Montana, which is not huge, each one of those electoral votes represents fewer voters than a corresponding electoral vote cast by people in Illinois or in California. So, is that fair? Have we not moved as a nation into a different sphere of relationships between states and federal government? You know, maybe back in 1787, the states regarded themselves as these separate but equal players in the national politics. But today, I mean, what are states? States are these sort of second-level political entities, and aren't we just fooling ourselves to think that we still are a federal republic? Of course, I don't want to jump to that conclusion too easily. The moment anyone does is when they suddenly fall afoul of all the things you've been listing that states, in fact, do retain oversight of. So the question then becomes one of principle. Do we want to continue as a federal regime, or are there facts we should be facing which point us towards something different? Of course, in the European Union, that's exactly why there's something like Brexit. That is why Mademoiselle Le Pen is making such a big splash. That is why other people in other member states in the European Union are not happy with results. The European Union has not yet produced Europe. It's still a union, whether it likes it or not, and Brexit is a testimony to that. Well, we might say, all right, we're not any longer an 18th century federation of states. Yeah, okay, fine, this is the 21st century, but we may find out that 18th century federation idea has more teeth in it than we expected. Again, it's a case of be careful what you wish for.
And I don't want to see a national election for president where the whole country has to be recounted to find out.
Well, this is part of what I was saying earlier about if you think the Electoral College is cumbersome, just try a direct national popular election. Now, the cumbersomeness will be different, but my suspicion is that it will become exponential. Now, you could counter that and say, all right, that's not the point. All right, suppose you've got an electoral system that is very cumbersome because it's a national direct election. Still, the principle of one man, one vote should triumph. and we should just bite the bullet and endure whatever difficulties would be generated by a national popular election. Again, I have to say that attractive as the phrase "one man, one vote" is, that is not in the Constitution either. I mean, that is in certain court decisions in the 20th century, but that's not in the Constitution either.
And would we be willing to give up the Senate and just have a
Well,
husband?
here's another thing, and that is, if you want to give up the federal principle, let's give up the Senate as well, because that's even more grossly unfair. Every state gets 2 and only 2 senators. So, again, this is what I mean when I say the Electoral College is an integral part of this federal republic, and the moment you begin removing a block that large from the edifice, then it's going to be very hard not to keep the other blocks from going astray.
Yeah. On this question of legitimacy, I mean, there are many different types of legitimacy, and democratic legitimacy is only one of them. The legitimacy of the European Commission derives from the consent of the governments and not of the peoples of those who govern. So in our system, we do not have a federal government and provinces. We have a federal government and states.
Mm-hmm.
And legitimacy of the federal government comes from the states and not from the people, the several states, and not from the several people of the several states.
Well, yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no is it's not Talmudic. It's because it is a mixed system. I mean, that's in the very nature of being a federal republic.
Right.
The Senate and the Electoral College remind us that we are a government of states. But the House of Representatives reminds us that we are also a government of Americans. That there's a national character as well.
But that's not my point. But the point is, yes, the ratification comes, had to be ratified by the several states, though.
In popular conventions, not by
In
state
popular
legislatures.
legislatures, not by the state legislatures.
And whose decision was it to make them popular? Was that part of the
That was part of the Constitutional Convention. They were busy trying to outflank the Confederation
Right,
Congress.
but the state, I mean, to make a kind of speculative case for this, suppose the people who are very unhappy with democracy now in the Democratic Party have decided that meritocracy is the way to go and not democracy. Suppose they take the state of California and decide to follow a million program of
A Cal exit.
reform. Well, no, that they might decide they want to be governed by giving, as sort of in the John Stuart Mill manner, giving extra votes to PhDs, God forbid, or people with higher degrees. I think that was Mills. So they had a
But only
different.
PhDs from accredited institutions.
Right, that would be, yeah. But Mill had this idea that you can have the more educated people have more votes.
Right.
All right, suppose they find some way of introducing meritocratic criteria. And they have the right to do that under the Constitution, right? The Constitution does not demand that they have one man, one vote systems.
No, the Constitution doesn't. Now, there is, and this is also a response to what you were saying, there is a history of federal jurisprudence about voting rights and voting procedures
Yeah, well, that's-
that does push towards regularizing and systematizing it. And in that respect, that's something I'm very thankful for, because if there was not, if there were not procedures in place, if there had not been federal court decisions, then you would have such irregularities from state to state, such variations from state to state, as almost to make the thing meaningless. It was, of course, exactly on the basis of state authority to determine voting eligibility that allowed Jim Crow to flourish in the post-Civil War South. And as none of us wants to replicate that. So there is a certain uniformity which is imposed. By and large, it is uniformity which has come from the federal courts.
Right.
Rather
Just
than
to
from
finish
Congress.
the argument, suppose you had one state decide an entirely different form of choosing its electors, right? And it was no longer democratic.
Mhm.
I would argue that the federal government is still legitimate because it represents the state. It is authorized by the states. And it's not illegitimate because one of those states or more has decided to choose its.
I mean, in such a case as that, actually what the state would be doing would be violating the Republican guarantee in the Constitution. Because, well, the Constitution guarantees to each state a Republican form of government. If a particular state...
But Republican forms of government don't require one man, one vote.
No, but on the other hand, they certainly don't enfranchise PhDs at the expense
So
of...
we all can agree that's a bad idea. Given the level of political awareness among many PhDs, I think we can all agree on that. Right. We could have an early Republican form of government where you had a property qualification, for example, God forbid, and that those, you could imagine that happening in a state that's in the grip of some oligarchy.
You could, although in that case, what I suspect is there would be an immediate challenge within that state. It would go into the federal courts and would be eliminated on the basis of the Republican
Yeah, I'm
guarantee.
just trying to make the theoretical point that no one would think the federal government was illegitimate because one state had a different mode of selecting its electors. And in fact, for a long time, we had this situation, right, in the 19th century, when some states did not have democratic selection,
True.
Other states did, and no one questioned that the federal government is illegitimate on that ground.
No, I would say, though, that the question of legitimacy does enter in, especially if in the environment of a direct national public election, or popular election, I mean, you would field up to 10 candidates. And this, of course, would be very possible. I mean, how many parties are there in the French election right now? I forget off the top of my head. I mean, in Germany, in the German federal elections, I think there were, 59 parties? All of them vying for seats in the Bundestag. You could get a situation in a direct... by the way, I should add as a footnote, and I say this in the text of the essay, that if you want to see a really complicated, mind-bogglingly complicated federal election process, just take a look at the German electoral process. Just looking at the German ballot is enough to make the eyes revolve back into the head. So, I mean, it almost looks like one from column A, one from column B. You think you're going to a Chinese restaurant, and it turns out to be a German federal election.
Chinese restaurants like that anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm rather fond of column A and column B. But anyway, I understand that. But so there are federal elections and then there are federal elections. But to come back to the issue of legitimacy is an important question. Because if, for instance, you did have an electoral field in which there were 10 candidates representing 10 parties in a direct popular election, then let's suppose one of them gets 12% of the vote and another gets 8% and then on out. Do you really think that a president elected that way is going to have the legitimacy, politically speaking, that is conferred by today in our system, the Electoral College? And at that point, you could have a president elected by that 12% to 8%. I mean, it's entirely possible. Which is why in many places where there are direct elections, such as in France, you have to go through this runoff system. And right, and then sometimes you get the 1, 2, 3 stages of the election of a president. Now, if you want to go in that direction, fine, but then don't come back to me afterwards and complain about the cumbersomeness of the Electoral College. One thing about the Electoral College is that, with the exception of Bush versus Gore and Tilden versus Hayes, at the end of Election Day, we know who the president is. That it's fairly obvious. So,
wouldn't the basic question be, does democracy have any weaknesses? Is democracy a form of government which is always improved when it is made more democratic? And if that's not the case, then that opens the door for limitations or hindrances or complications. The Constitution is a complicated form of government. people who argue for a popular election think of it. You're saying this is wrong, but I mean, and I think I agree. But think of it as simple, and that whenever an argument is raised that there's a certain undemocratic feature, then that must be accepted as and that democracy can always be made better by making it more democratic.
Well, the ultimate way of making something democratic is secession, and that didn't turn out too well the last time that was tried here.
That's a good point too.
And in fact, Lincoln said that the problem with secession is that it only looks like it's democratic. What it really is anarchy. Because if every time there's an election, one party to the election can claim that it's disaffected and wants to take its bat and ball and go home, then what you have is not democracy. What you have is not a government at all, but what you have is the collapse of it. So secession would have been an ultimate form of democracy, but the problem is that it really wouldn't have been democracy at the end of the day. It would have been anarchy, and anarchy would have invited the general on the white horse. It would have invited the Napoleon Bonaparte, and that would have been an end to all expressions of democracy. So yes, democracy, but democracy within orderly limits.
So the democratic principle, simplistically understood, is the biggest enemy of democracy.
In some respects, because we're not all a town meeting.
Yeah.
All right? And we can't settle it all like student council in high school, just by taking a quick show of hands. And this was why one of the challenges to the Constitutional Convention, and Madison works on this when he composes this pre-convention document talking about the 12 evils that are bedeviling Americans. One of them is this conviction that democracies can, in fact, only work on very small scale, face-to-face level. Madison has to invert that argument in Federalist Number 10, where he says, no, in fact, a big country is exactly what will help democracy, because it'll allow the passions of democracy to be dispelled in the open air of a large country. But that's a realization that many of the members of the Constitutional Convention came to the convention equipped with, and that is, democracy is only going to work on a small level. If we're going to make the United States work on a larger level, then it has to be not just democracy and democratic principles, but there also have to be gradations, there have to be rules, there has to be a certain structure in which democracy inhabits. Fundamentally, I know I'm sounding like I'm playing with words here for a moment, but bear with me. We are, at the end of the day, a republic. We all agree on that. That's what we are. We're a republic. We are not a democracy. Democracy really ought to be used as an adjective rather than a noun, because republics exist on a spectrum. Republics are more or less democratic. So you can have republics like Renaissance Florence, all right, which is basically run by an oligarchy. Or you can have a republic which is extremely democratic. And over our history, we started out being more democratic than most republics, and we have become progressively more democratic over time. But we're still a republic. So democracy is the adjective. It's republic which is the noun, and republic is what we really are.
Do you see a problem in the fact, as it seems, that one of our parties agrees with this and the other doesn't?
Oh, I don't think that
agrees with the distinction between democracy and republic and the other doesn't.
Well, we have a great deal of terminological confusion, because ever since the 19th century, we have tended to use the words democracy and republic interchangeably. This is why I had to beg everyone's indulgence for what seemed to be being very finicky about words. And so much has been written, and with such eloquence, into the very bones of our national character about democracy, that I'm very loath to strip it all out and say, oh, well, we ought not to talk about democracy now. No, we should talk about democracy, but we also have to bear in mind the specific uses of it and the specific potential for abuses. Should we, I mean, is it a case where one party is much more a paladin of a particular view than another? Well, I'm not entirely certain that's the case.
But isn't it a custom at this forum that you beat up the Democratic Party at the end of the the end of the seminar a little bit?
Not having been a participant previously, I can only profess a certain degree of agnosticism. I do not wish to beat up on any of the parties, because in the long history of the political parties in this country, some have had very shining, wonderful moments, and those moments have then decayed into corruption. Lincoln's Republicans were on the high road until we get to the administrations of Ulysses Grant, and then things start to fall apart. So I never want to say never about a particular political party. Like every other aspect of human government, political parties are the creations of fallible human beings, and they reflect that from time to time.
And the Democrats shouldn't complain, because of all the institutions in America that exist or have existed over the main course of our history, the Democratic Party is the one with the greatest involvement and promotion of both slavery and segregation.
You've noticed that.
Yes.
Well,
So I bring that up.
yes, I know.
But actually, my point was that I think, I mean, the Democrats might be justly or justifiably worried that what's in it for us, what in the Constitution is in it for us? What's our advantage in having a Constitution? And it seems it's all these five candidates. They're all Republicans who won with the Electoral College, and so I mean, well, how does it help us?
I don't think it's a question of how does it help us. It's a question of how does it help the Republic as a whole. Where's the self-denying ordinance? The Founding Fathers did not create the document they did. The founders did not, in fact, create a republic because they one day threw a number of possibilities into a hat and threw it in the air and caught one and said, oh, I guess this means we're supposed to be a republic. The whole drift of Enlightenment political thought had been to say, all right, can we discover a political order that is as natural as what has been discovered in the material physical order by Galileo, by Newton, by the scientific revolution of the 17th century? Can we find a political correspondent to that? Are laws, natural laws like gravity, can we find something like that in human experience that will allow us to construct governments that are not artificial, that are not irrational, but that reflect a natural order? And the whole drift of Enlightenment political thought from Locke through Montesquieu to Jefferson and so on, it's all about, all right, here is what the natural order is. And for them, a republic is what captures a natural order of political affairs. So they're committed to this for its own sake. They believe that they have discovered a law of human society as tangible as what Newton develops in a law of gravity. So the question then ought not to be, well, what's in it for us? It's not a question of advantage, it's a question of what approximates the law of nature itself. And for them, a republic is what approximates the law of nature.
But still, wouldn't it be better if the Constitution could be shown to profit equally the two parties?
Well, that would have been very, very difficult to do because the political parties, of course, themselves didn't exist at the time of the Constitution. And in fact, there is some question as to whether the Constitutional Convention would have broken up in holy horror if someone had revealed to them that within a decade, two political parties in America would be at each other's throats.
Yeah.
I mean, Jefferson himself makes the wonderful comment that if he could not go to heaven but except by a party, he'd rather not go at all.
Because he didn't believe in heaven.
No, I actually think the real problem there is, can you believe Jefferson? Because Jefferson, of course, is one of the partisan founders of a political party.
What year
I
did
mean,
you make that statement?
What year?
Yeah.
I think that
Pre-19...
I'm pretty sure it's in the 1790s when he's Secretary of State. By the time he gets elected president, in his inaugural, he says, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. That's what he says publicly. Privately, he's writing and says, I'm going to sink federalism into an abyss from which it will never emerge. So there was another man who was great at articulating principles and ideas, but in terms of practice, as Sally Hemings could demonstrate, it left something to be desired.
All right, one more question.
There's a curious part of the system, too, is the amount of representatives each state has is based on population, not on citizens and not on how many registered voters they are. So when you're trying to figure, and I try to figure this out, how many, in Wyoming, there's so many representatives, but there's only fewer people voting, how much power they really have compared to people voting in California.
Well,
You can't find those.
But you can't shift the basis that way all that easily. After all, the Constitution recognized that. That's why there's a federal census. But the other problem is that the movement of people, the American population is extremely mobile. If you're going to make it on the basis of registered voters, then you've got registered voters who are picking up and moving every 3 or 4 years. That's not going to really give you any relief. In fact, the curiosity is that there was no such thing as a registered voter in 1787. In fact, there won't be any such thing as registered voters until Reconstruction. There are no voting rolls. There are no registration rolls. That doesn't happen until Reconstruction. In fact, there's nothing that you could really call party membership. People affiliated themselves with parties, but there were no party membership lists. You showed up at the polls. Nobody asked whether you were a Whig or a Democrat. In fact, when you showed up at the polls, what you usually handed in was a ballot of candidates that you'd clipped out of a local newspaper. So there was nothing like the apparatus of voting that we have today.
Thanks so much, Alan.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Harvey, for the presidential term. All of a sudden, it will erupt every 4 years, something like Old Faithful. So you can expect this big spout of energy on the subject of the Electoral College. But I felt the subject really did need a little bit of help to make it sound compelling. So I did, in a rather free and perhaps libertine fashion, suggest all these other meetings as well. We'll see if they live up to it. The Electoral College, as you have no doubt noticed, has come in for more than a little criticism in the last several months. The results of the 2016 election were not only surprising, but for many people dismaying because of the nature of the way the election results resulted. A victory in the Electoral College, but not in the popular vote. And that led many commentators to really push the op-ed panic buttons on the subject of the Electoral College. You saw this from E.J. Dione in the Washington Post. You saw it from the New York Times editorial board, the New York Review of Books, and you saw it from Yale's Akil Reed Amar, not only objecting to what they believed was the undemocratic nature of the Electoral College, but even indicting it for a few other crimes as well. Amar, in particular, has held the Electoral College up on the toasting fork for being an adjunct of slavery. And as Amar says, in a direct election system, the North would outnumber the South, whose many slaves, more than 500,000 in all, of course, could not vote, But the Electoral College instead let each Southern state count its slaves, albeit with a 2/5 discount in computing its share of the overall count. So not only has the Electoral College frequently selected the wrong people, in someone's estimate, but it is also complicit with slavery. How often has the Electoral College posed a problem? Well, curiously enough, really only on 5 occasions in American political history. In 1824, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay were all major nominees. So you did have a big split in the popular vote. You also had a split in the Electoral College vote. Enough of a split that the election ended up being thrown into the House of Representatives, where John Quincy Adams ultimately was selected as president in connection with what was widely described as the corrupt bargain between Clay and Quincy Adams. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is the first president to be elected without any kind of popular majority, but with a whopping total in the Electoral College. So you have to move from 1824 to 1860 really to get a clear-cut example of someone who would not have won a popular majority, but nevertheless wins the presidency because of the Electoral College. Then in 1876, it happens again. This time, Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes. Samuel Tilden really wins the popular vote, but by a lot of internal political machinations.
This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Alan Guelzo, and he's a professor of the Civil War era and director of the Civil War era studies at Gettysburg College, Pennsylvania, a well-known town. He's the author of several books on Lincoln. I would say he is the leading scholar of Abraham Lincoln in America now. Abraham Lincoln Redeemer President, which won a prize, the Lincoln Prize in 2000. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the end of slavery, which won another prize in 2005, and Lincoln and Douglas, the debates that defined America, which also won a prize in 2008. And recently he's written Abraham Lincoln as a Man of Ideas, and Lincoln, a very short introduction. And he's written a history of the Civil War, which I've just finished reading myself. I'm in the midst of his most recent book, I think it is, on Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. So this is a Lincoln scholar who's come to us today to speak on the Electoral College, certainly a timely topic. And he's found an interesting title for us, The Lovely, Fair, Judicious, and Democratic Meaning of the Electoral College. Let's check to see each one of those adjectives is justified. So, Alan Guelzo.
All right. The Electoral College majority is awarded to Rutherford B. Hayes. The Electoral College majority in this case is a grand sum total of 1 vote, 185 to 184, but it is sufficient to elect Hayes as president. As with the Jackson, Adams, and Clay election in 1824, there's a good deal of behind the scenes and not always free from corrupt accusations going on behind the curtain. And then we have a long period in which the Electoral College really is not much of a serious issue, until 2000, when you have Bush versus Gore, and the hanging chads proceed to dance across the national television screens. And then, of course, most recently, Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton, where Mrs. Clinton wins 3 million more popular votes, but Mr. Trump wins a decisive majority in the Electoral College. Well, these have been the occasions, and when you take it in the long run of American electoral history, it's rather surprising that there have been this few elections that really have made question marks for the Electoral College. What the Electoral College does is it reminds us that, first of all, we are a constitutional republic. And we are governed by a constitution. And in that Constitution, we have a mechanism identified for electing presidents, and this is it. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the... Thank you, Harvey, very, very much indeed for the opportunity to participate in this program. And to all of you here, thank you for coming, and to all who have had a hand in making my brief visit here to Harvard a very pleasant experience. I do have some connections to Harvard going back a number of years when I was a fellow at the Warren Center in the mid-1990s. That was when it was still housed in Robinson Hall, and afforded the opportunity to interact with such luminaries as Bernard Bailyn and Donald Fleming, names well storied in Harvard yore. Well, let me talk about the Electoral College just for a little bit. We had gone back and forth on exactly the format to pursue with this, and what we settled on was that we would distribute in advance the text of this essay, and I would give a brief 15-minute run-through to warm things up, and then sit down and we can all go at it with knife and fork. But let me at least give you a brief encapsulation of what I mean by the lovely, fair, judicious, and democratic meaning of the Electoral College, a title which I have to confess quite shamelessly was meant to provoke people. After all, if you simply offer a lecture on why I like the Electoral College, nobody is really going to come to it because it's really not a subject that people waste a great deal of time upon, at least not for usually 3 years and 11 months of any given